Before I start this story, I need to give you a warning that might completely change the way you're about to watch this. The ending of this story is so shocking, so unexpected, that many people simply don't believe what they're seeing. But here's the most important part. YouTube only delivers the ending to people who are subscribed to the channel. If you don't subscribe right now, you won't see anything. So do this before we continue. Subscribe right now, hit the like button, and comment the city you're watching from. We love knowing how far these stories reach. The fluorescent lights of St. Mary's Hospital flickered overhead as Laura Christensen counted the hours until her shift ended. What she didn't know was that in exactly 47 minutes, a man in a $1,000 suit would walk through those emergency room doors and change her life forever. A man who would offer her a deal so dangerous, so impossible, that accepting it would either save her or destroy her completely. This is a story of desperation, deception, and a love that neither of them saw coming. A love that would test everything they thought they knew about trust, wealth, and what it truly means to belong to someone. Don't miss a thing. Subscribe now and discover the ending of this and other thrilling and dramatic stories. Because what happens when 30 days of pretending becomes a lifetime of wanting? When a contract becomes a promise? When cold indifference melts into consuming passion? Stay with us, because the ending of this story will leave you breathless. Laura's fingers trembled slightly as she checked the IV drip on her patient in room 304. The tremor wasn't from exhaustion, though she had been on her feet for 11 hours straight. It was from the weight of the envelope in her pocket, another notice from the debt collection agency. $23,000. That's what her mother's experimental cancer treatment had cost before she died 6 months ago. $23,000 that Laura didn't have, had never had, and probably would never have on a nurse's salary of $42,000 a year. The irony wasn't lost on her. She spent her days saving lives, watching doctors perform miracles, surrounded by medicine and hope. Yet she couldn't save the one person who mattered most. Her mother, Evelyn Christensen, had been everything to her. A single parent who worked 3 jobs to put Laura through nursing school. A woman who never complained, never gave up, never stopped believing that tomorrow would be better than today. And Laura had failed her. Not medically. The cancer had been too aggressive, too far gone by the time they caught it. But financially, the experimental treatment that might have given her mother 6 more months, maybe a year, had been within reach. If only Laura had the money. If only she had taken out more loans. If only. Now those loans were coming due, and Laura was drowning. Nurse Christensen? A voice pulled her from her thoughts. Dr. Martinez stood in the doorway, his kind eyes creased with concern. "You okay? You've been staring at that IV bag for 5 minutes." Laura forced a smile. "Just tired. Long shift. Why don't you head out? We've got it covered. You've been pulling doubles all week." She wanted to say yes. Wanted to collapse into bed and sleep for 3 days straight. But overtime meant time and a half pay, and she needed every dollar. "I'm fine. Really." Dr. Martinez studied her. For a moment, then nodded. He knew about her situation. Everyone at St. Mary's did. The staff had even taken up a collection after Evelyn died, raising nearly $2,000. It had been touching, humiliating, and nowhere near enough. Laura finished her rounds and headed toward the break room, her feet aching in her sensible white sneakers. The hospital corridors were quieter now, the chaos of the day giving way to the eerie calm of evening. She was halfway to the staff room when the commotion erupted from the ER entrance. "I need a doctor! Now!" The voice was commanding, urgent, and edged with barely controlled panic. Laura's training kicked in immediately. She spun around and ran toward the sound, her exhaustion forgotten. A man stood in the middle of the ER, holding another man who was bleeding profusely from a gash on his forehead. But it wasn't the injured man that made Laura stop short. It was the one holding him. He was tall, easily 6'3", with dark hair that looked professionally styled even in disarray. His suit was charcoal gray, perfectly tailored, probably worth more than Laura made in 2 months. His jaw was sharp enough to cut glass, and his eyes, steel blue and absolutely furious, swept across the emergency room like a general surveying a battlefield. "Someone help him," the man demanded, his voice cold and precise. "I'll pay whatever it costs." Laura moved forward automatically. "Sir, we need you to stay calm. Let's get him onto a gurney." She signaled to 2 nearby orderlies, who rushed over with a stretcher. "He slipped on my office stairs," the tall man explained tersely as they transferred the injured man, who appeared to be in his 60s and semi-conscious, onto the gurney. "Hit his head on the marble floor. He was unconscious for maybe 30 seconds. "Does he have any medical conditions we should know about?" Laura asked, already assessing the patient's pupils, checking his pulse. "Heart condition. He takes medication. I don't know what kind." The man's voice cracked slightly on the last words, revealing a hairline fracture in his icy composure. "We'll take care of him," Laura assured him, nodding to the orderlies who began wheeling the patient toward the trauma bay. She turned to the tall man. "Sir, if you'll wait here, someone will come out to update you shortly. We'll need some information." "That's my grandfather," the man interrupted, his eyes fixed on the doors where his grandfather had just disappeared. "Richard Constantine Thorne. I'm Alexander Thorne. And I'm not going anywhere until I know he's okay." Alexander Thorne. The name hit Laura like a physical force. Everyone in New York knew that name. Thorne Industries, one of the largest tech conglomerates in the country, worth billions. And Alexander Thorne was its CEO, the golden boy of Silicon Valley, who had taken over his family's company at the unprecedented age of 28 and tripled its value in 5 years. And he was standing in her emergency room, covered in his grandfather's blood. "Mr. Thorne," Laura said gently, falling back on her professional training. "You should sit down. You're in shock." He looked down at his hands as if seeing them for the first time. They were trembling slightly, stained red. "I'm fine." "You're not. Please, sit." She guided him toward a chair, and surprisingly, he let her. "I'll get you some water and something to clean your hands with." Laura returned moments later with a bottle of water, some towels, and a bowl of warm, soapy water. Alexander Thorne sat exactly where she'd left him, staring at his hands like they belonged to someone else. "Here." She knelt beside him and began cleaning the blood from his fingers. Up close, she could see the fine lines of stress around his eyes, the shadow of stubble on his jaw, the way his expensive cologne mixed with the metallic scent of blood. He was younger than she'd thought, maybe 32 or 33, and exhausted beneath the commanding exterior. "Thank you," he said quietly, watching her work. "What's your name?" "Laura. Laura Christensen." "You're very calm, Laura Christensen." She smiled slightly. "It's my job. Your grandfather is in good hands. Dr. Martinez is one of the best." They sat in silence for a moment, Laura methodically cleaning his hands, while the ER buzzed around them. She was acutely aware of how surreal this was. Her, a nurse buried in debt, kneeling beside one of the richest men in America, washing blood from his hands like some modern-day biblical scene. "He raised me," Alexander said suddenly. "My parents died when I was 8. Car accident. My grandfather took me in, taught me everything about the business, about life. He's 83 years old and still comes to the office every day, still tries to tell me how to run things." A ghost of a smile crossed his face. "He's the most stubborn man I've ever met." "Sounds like he's a fighter," Laura said. "That's good. He has to be. There's so much left." Alexander trailed off, his jaw tightening. "He can't die. Not now. Not when everything is so complicated." Before Laura could respond, Dr. Martinez emerged from the trauma bay. Alexander was on his feet instantly. "Your grandfather has a concussion and needed 17 stitches, Dr. Martinez reported. We're going to keep him overnight for observation because of his age and heart condition, but his vitals are stable. He's going to be fine, Mr. Thorne." Laura watched the tension drain from Alexander's shoulders. "Can I see him?" He's asking for you. Room 308, down that hall." Alexander nodded and started to walk away, then paused. He turned back to Laura, those steel-blue eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Thank you, Nurse Christensen, for your help and your kindness." Then he was gone, disappearing down the corridor toward his grandfather's room. Laura stood there for a moment, still feeling the weight of his gaze, before shaking her head and returning to work. In 3 hours, her shift would end. In 3 hours, she would go home to her tiny studio apartment in Brooklyn, eat ramen noodles for dinner, and fall asleep, worrying about the $23,000 she owed. The encounter with Alexander Thorne would just be another story to tell. The night she met a billionaire in the ER, or so she thought. 3 days later, Laura was walking out of the hospital after another double shift when she saw him. Alexander Thorne stood beside a sleek black Mercedes parked illegally in front of St. Mary's main entrance. He wore another impeccable suit, navy this time, and he was looking directly at her. Laura's first instinct was to assume he was waiting for someone else. But as she tried to walk past, he called her name. "Nurse Christensen, Laura." She stopped, turning slowly. "Mr. Thorne, how's your grandfather?" "Recovering. Stubborn as ever, which the doctors say is a good sign." He stepped toward her, and in the dim light of the street lamps, his face was all sharp angles and shadows. "I need to speak with you. It's urgent." "About your grandfather's care? I can direct you to—" "No." He cut her off. "About a business proposition. One that could benefit both of us considerably." Laura's exhaustion made her blunt. "Mr. Thorne, I don't know what you think, but I'm not interested in any kind of—" $25,000, he interrupted. "Cash, in exchange for 30 days of your time." The number hit her like a slap. $25,000, more than her debt. Enough to clear her name, start over, maybe even save something for the future. But nothing in life was free, especially from men like Alexander Thorne. "What would I have to do?" she asked, her voice harder than intended. "Marry me." The words hung in the air between them, absurd and impossible. Laura actually laughed. "I'm sorry, what?" Alexander didn't smile. "My grandfather had a heart episode yesterday. Nothing serious, but it scared him. He updated his will. As it stands, I won't receive my full inheritance from the family trust unless I'm married by my 33rd birthday, which is in 45 days. That's archaic. That's my grandfather. He believes in family, in legacy, in the importance of settling down." Alexander's voice was clinical, detached. "I don't have time for relationships. My company is in the middle of a hostile takeover attempt. I work 18-hour days. The last thing I need is romantic complications. So you want a fake wife? I want a contractual arrangement. 30 days of public appearances, living together for authenticity, attending family events. After that, a quiet annulment. You'll receive $25,000, paid up front, and a confidentiality agreement that protects both of us." Laura stared at him. "You're serious?" "Completely. Why me?" "Because you're professional, trustworthy. My grandfather liked you. He asked about you twice during his hospital. Stay. And because you need the money." His eyes held hers. "I saw the debt collection letter in your pocket the other night. I know you're drowning financially. This is a lifeline for both of us." The casual way he mentioned her poverty made Laura's cheeks burn. "You investigated me. I did my due diligence. Your mother died 6 months ago from cancer. You've taken out multiple loans to cover her treatment costs. You work 60-hour weeks trying to stay afloat. Your credit score is in the A toilet, and you're 1 month away from defaulting." He paused. "I'm not judging you, Laura. I'm offering you a solution. A fake marriage." "Yes. That's insane. That's business." Alexander pulled an envelope from his jacket. "I've had my lawyers draw up a contract. Read it. Think about it. If you agree, meet me at this address tomorrow at noon." He handed her the envelope along with a business card. If not, we never had this conversation. Then he got into his Mercedes and drove away, leaving Laura standing on the sidewalk with an envelope that felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. Already subscribed? Leave a like and tell us where you're watching from. We want to know where our audience comes from. Laura didn't sleep that night. She sat at her tiny kitchen table, a wobbly IKEA special that she'd bought for $40, and read the contract 3 times. It was surprisingly straightforward. 30 days from the date of signing. They would live together in his penthouse apartment in Manhattan. She would accompany him to all necessary social and family events. They would present a united front as a happily married couple. At the end of 30 days, they would file for an annulment based on irreconcilable differences. The payment, $25,000, transferred to her account immediately upon signing, plus a $10,000 bonus if she successfully maintained the facade for the full 30 days without breaking character or causing scandal. There were pages of clauses about confidentiality, non-disclosure, behavioral expectations. Nothing about sex. In fact, there was an explicit clause stating that the relationship was purely professional and that separate bedrooms would be maintained. It was clinical, cold, exactly what she'd expect from a man like Alexander Thorne, and it was her only way out. Laura thought about her mother's funeral, the way she'd stood beside the grave, knowing she'd failed, the collection letters piling up on her. Counter. The panic attacks she had late at night when she calculated how long it would take to pay off her debt on her current salary. 7 years if she was lucky and nothing else went wrong. 7 years of living like this. 7 years of barely surviving. Or 30 days of pretending to love a stranger. At 11:47 a.m. the next day, Laura stood outside the address Alexander had given her, a law office in Midtown Manhattan with glass walls and modern furniture that probably cost more than her annual salary. Her hands were shaking. She'd almost turned back twice, but she thought of her mother, of the sacrifices Evelyn had made for her, and she thought of what her mother would say. Sometimes, Laura Bear, we have to take risks. We have to jump even when we can't see where we'll land. Laura pushed open the door. Alexander was already there, seated at a long conference table with 2 lawyers flanking him. He stood when she entered, and for a moment, something flickered in his eyes, surprise maybe, that she'd actually come. "Ms. Christensen," he said formally, "please, sit." The next hour was a blur of legal terminology and signatures. Laura barely processed half of it. She kept thinking, this is insane. I'm insane. What am I doing? But every time she wavered, one of the lawyers would mention the payment schedule, and she would remember the number, $25,000. Freedom. "There's one more thing," Alexander said after the contracts were signed. He pulled out a small velvet box and opened it, revealing a ring that made Laura's breath catch. It was a princess-cut diamond, easily 3 carats, set in platinum with smaller diamonds along the band. It was the kind of ring that belonged in a museum, not on her finger. "I can't wear that," Laura said immediately. "I'll lose it, or get mugged, or—" "It's insured," Alexander said curtly. He took her left hand. His touch was warm, impersonal, and slid the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly. Of course it did. He'd probably had it sized based on whatever background check he'd run on her. The weight of it felt wrong. Too heavy. Too real. "We'll announce the marriage in 3 days," Alexander continued, releasing her hand. "That gives you time to quit your job." "I'm not quitting my job." He looked at her sharply. "You have to. We're supposed to be newlyweds. What kind of billionaire's wife works night shifts at a hospital?" "The kind who loves her job," Laura said firmly. "And the kind, who knows this is temporary. I'm not giving up my career for a 30-day arrangement." For a moment they stared at each other, locked in a silent battle of wills. Then, surprisingly, Alexander nodded. "Fine. But you'll take a leave of absence. 4 weeks. We'll say it's for our honeymoon." "Fine. Good." He stood, signaling the meeting was over. My driver will pick you up at 8 a.m. tomorrow. Pack enough for a month. You're moving into my penthouse tonight. Laura's heart hammered. Tonight? But I need time to— The money is already in your account, Alexander said coldly. Check your phone. Laura pulled out her phone with trembling fingers and opened her banking app. The number on the screen made her dizzy. $25,000 deposited 2 minutes ago. It was real. This was really happening. 8 a.m., Alexander repeated. Then he walked out, leaving Laura alone with 2 lawyers, a marriage certificate that felt like a lie, and a diamond ring that caught the light like a tiny, expensive trap. That night, in her tiny apartment, Laura packed her life into 2 suitcases, clothes, toiletries, the few photos she had of her mother. She took one last look around the studio that had been her home for 3 years. The chipped paint, the radiator that clanked all winter, the window with the view of a brick wall. She didn't know what Alexander Thorne's penthouse would look like, but she knew it wouldn't be this. And she knew, with a certainty that made her stomach twist, that once she walked out that door tomorrow morning, nothing would ever be the same. The Mercedes arrived at exactly 8 a.m. The driver, a silent, professional man in his 50s, loaded Laura's suitcases into the trunk while she stood on the sidewalk, taking one last look at her building. Her landlord had been surprisingly understanding when she'd called to break her lease. Apparently, being married to Alexander Thorne opened a lot of doors, even if that marriage was a complete fabrication. The drive to Alexander's penthouse took 20 minutes. 20 minutes through Manhattan's morning traffic, through neighborhoods that got progressively more expensive, until they pulled up in front of a building that looked like it belonged in an architectural magazine. Glass, steel, modern lines that screamed wealth and exclusivity. A doorman opened her car door. Mrs. Thorne, welcome. Mrs. Thorne. The name felt like someone else's skin. The elevator to the penthouse required a special key. The driver handed it to her. She was apparently expected to come and go as she pleased. And then the doors closed, leaving Laura alone in a glass box that climbed toward the sky. The elevator opened directly into the penthouse. Laura stepped out and forgot how to breathe. The space was enormous. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of Manhattan, the Empire State Building, Central Park in the distance, the glittering sprawl of the city laid out like a toy. The furniture was minimalist and expensive, all clean lines and neutral colors. Everything was spotless, perfectly arranged, utterly devoid of personality. It looked like a showroom, a beautiful, cold, empty showroom. You're here. Laura spun around. Alexander emerged from a hallway, dressed in a suit despite it being Saturday morning. His hair was damp, like he'd just showered, and he looked as exhausted as she felt. Your room is down that hall, second door on the right, he said, pointing. I've already had your things taken up. There's a bathroom en suite. You'll have complete privacy. Thank you, Laura said, her voice echoing in the cavernous space. We have dinner tonight with my grandfather, Alexander continued, checking his watch. He wants to meet my new wife properly. We'll need to get our story straight before then. Our story? How we met, how I proposed, why we got married so quickly. He moved to the kitchen, an affair of white marble and stainless steel, and poured himself a coffee. We'll say, we met when my grandfather was hospitalized. It was love at first sight. I proposed a week later because I knew you were the one. Simple, romantic, believable. That's not how life works. We're not living life. We're performing it. Alexander's voice was flat. And we need to be convincing. My grandfather is sharp. If he suspects this is a business arrangement, the whole plan falls apart. Laura felt something cold settle in her stomach. What happens if he finds out? He won't. It wasn't. Reassurance. It was an order. They spent the next hour crafting their fiction, where they had their first date, a small Italian restaurant in the West Village. What Alexander loved about her, her compassion, her dedication to helping others, the way she made him laugh, which Laura privately thought was ironic since she'd never seen him smile. How she felt when he proposed, Surprised, overwhelmed, certain. It was like writing a play, except they were the actors, and the audience was everyone they knew. By the time Alexander's driver came to take them to dinner, Laura felt like she'd memorized a script. She'd also changed into the one nice dress she owned, a simple black cocktail dress that her mother had bought her years ago for a hospital charity gala. It felt inadequate compared to the designer labels she'd seen in Alexander's closet, but it was all she had. Alexander looked at her as she emerged from her room, and something flickered across his face too quickly for her to read. "You look nice," he said stiffly. "Thank you." The drive to Richard Thorne's estate took 45 minutes. They headed north, away from the city, into neighborhoods with names like Westchester and gated communities with security checkpoints. The Thorne family mansion sat on 12 acres of manicured lawns, behind iron gates and a circular driveway that could fit 20 cars. Laura's mouth went dry. This wasn't just wealth. This was generational fortune, old money, the kind of privilege that she'd only ever seen in movies. "Breathe," Alexander said quietly beside her. "He's just a man. A stubborn, opinionated, occasionally impossible man. But still just a man. Easy for you to say. You're actually related to him. And you're supposedly married to me, which makes you family now." Alexander's hand found hers, his fingers warm and strong. "We're in this together, remember? For the next 30 days, you're not alone." It was the first kind thing he'd said to her since this whole arrangement began. Laura squeezed his hand gratefully, and they walked into the lion's den together. Richard Constantine Thorne sat in a leather armchair in a study filled with old books and older money. At 83, he still had the bearing of the business titan he'd been. Straight spine, sharp eyes, a jaw that suggested he'd never backed down from a fight in his life. The bandage on his forehead was the only sign of his recent injury. "So," he said as Laura and Alexander entered, "this is the girl who captured my grandson's heart." Alexander's hand tightened almost imperceptibly on Laura's. She forced herself to smile. "Mr. Thorne, it's wonderful to see you recovered. Please call me Richard. We're family now." He gestured to the sofa across from him. "Sit. Tell me everything." Alexander has been maddeningly secretive about this whole whirlwind romance. For the next 2 hours, Laura and Alexander performed the greatest act of their lives. They told their fabricated story with such detail, such warmth, such apparently genuine affection that Laura almost believed it herself. They laughed in the right places, touched each other's hands naturally, exchanged looks that suggested years of intimacy rather than days of contract negotiations. And Richard ate it up. "I have to admit," he said over dinner, a 5-course meal served by a silent, efficient staff, "I had my doubts when Alexander called to say he'd gotten married. He's always been so focused on work, so allergic to commitment. But seeing you two together," he smiled, and it transformed his stern face into something gentle. "You remind me of my late wife and me, the way you look at each other, like you found your home." Laura felt guilt twist in her stomach. This man had just been hospitalized. He was elderly, vulnerable, trying to secure his legacy. And they were lying to him, using his desire for his grandson's happiness to manipulate him. But she'd already taken the money, already signed the contract. There was no backing out now. "She's remarkable," Alexander said, and his voice held a warmth that hadn't been there before. "She saved my grandfather's life the night of the accident. I knew then that she was special." Richard reached across the table and took Laura's hand. His skin was papery with age, spotted with liver marks, but his grip was firm. "Welcome to the family, Laura. You've given an old man peace of mind. I can die knowing Alexander won't be alone." "Don't talk about dying," Alexander said sharply. "You're going to outlive us all." "Maybe." Richard released Laura's hand and leaned back. "But just in case, I'm throwing you to an engagement party. Next Saturday. All of New York society will be there. I want everyone to meet the woman who finally tamed the great Alexander Thorne." Laura felt the trap snap shut. A party. Hundreds of people. Hundreds of opportunities for their house of cards to collapse. "Grandfather, that's not necessary," Alexander began. "Nonsense. It's completely necessary. I've already called the caterers." Richard's smile was pure mischief. "Consider it my wedding gift to you both. Now let's have dessert. I want to hear more about how you proposed, Alexander." I'm sure it was suitably dramatic. As Alexander launched into another fictional story, this one about a candlelit proposal on the Brooklyn Bridge, Laura felt the weight of the next 30 days settle onto her shoulders like a physical thing. This wasn't going to be simple. This wasn't going to be easy. And as she caught Alexander's eye across the table, saw the flash of something unreadable in those steel-blue depths, she wondered if maybe this wasn't going to be fake for very much longer. The ride home was silent. Alexander stared out the window, his jaw tight, while Laura studied her hands. The engagement ring caught the streetlights, throwing fractured rainbows across the leather seat. She couldn't stop thinking about Richard's face when he talked about his late wife. The genuine joy when he looked at her and Alexander together. "He really loves you," Laura said quietly. "I know. This is going to destroy him when he finds out the truth." Alexander's head snapped toward her, his eyes cold. "He won't find out. We have a contract. You agreed to this." "I know I did. Laura trailed off. What could she say? That her conscience was eating her alive? That she'd spent the entire dinner feeling like the worst person on earth? "He seems like a good man." "He is, which is why I'm doing this." Alexander's voice was hard. "My grandfather built Thorne Industries from nothing. He sacrificed everything for that company, his time, his health, his relationship with my father. And now he wants to see it continue, to know that his legacy is secure. If getting married gives him that peace, then that's what I'll do. Even if it's a lie, especially because it's a lie." Alexander looked at her steadily. "The truth is, I don't have time for love. Romance is a distraction I can't afford, but my grandfather doesn't need to know that. He needs to believe that I'm happy, settled, ready to carry on the family name. And for 30 days, that's exactly what we're going to give him." Laura wanted to argue, wanted to point out that maybe he was missing something important, that maybe there was more to life than business and duty, but she had no right to judge. She'd sold herself into this arrangement just as completely as he had. They didn't speak again until they reached the penthouse. "We need to establish some ground rules," Alexander said as they rode the elevator up. "This party next week is critical. We'll need to attend some events together before then. Be seen in public, build our narrative. I've already arranged for a stylist to come tomorrow to update your wardrobe." "My wardrobe is fine." "Your wardrobe is—" He stopped himself. "You're the wife of a CEO now. People will expect a certain image. I need you to look the part." Laura's cheeks burned. "You mean you're ashamed to be seen with me as I am?" "I mean that appearances matter in my world. Every outfit, every accessory, every public interaction is a message. We need to control that message. And I'm just another accessory you need to control." Alexander's jaw tightened. "You're the one who agreed to this arrangement. Don't act surprised by the terms now." They stood in the elevator, the tension between them crackling like electricity. Laura was, suddenly, viscerally aware of how alone they were. How close he was standing, how his cologne, something expensive and masculine, filled the small space. "You're right," she said finally. "I did agree. So let your stylist come. Dress me up like a doll. I'll play whatever part you need me to play." Something flickered in Alexander's eyes. Frustration, maybe, or disappointment. But before he could respond, the elevator doors opened onto the penthouse. Laura walked straight to her room and closed the door. She didn't cry. She'd learned years ago, watching her mother work herself to exhaustion, that tears were a luxury she couldn't afford. Instead, she sat on the edge of the massive bed, probably worth more than her entire apartment had been, and tried to remember why she'd agreed to this. $25,000. That was why. But as Laura lay back against the silk pillows, staring up at the ceiling of a penthouse that would never be hers. She wondered if maybe some prices were too high to pay, even for freedom. The next 2 weeks were a carefully orchestrated performance. The stylist arrived as promised, a severe woman named Isabel, who looked at Laura's existing wardrobe with barely concealed horror, and then spent 6 hours transforming her into someone Laura barely recognized. Designer dresses, tailored blazers, shoes that cost more than a month's rent, jewelry that came with insurance paperwork. Laura stood in front of the mirror in her room, looking at this strange, polished version of herself, and felt like an imposter. But Alexander approved. Perfect, he'd said when she emerged in a cream-colored Chanel dress for their first public appearance, a charity gala for the Metropolitan Museum of Art. You look like you belong. The gala was a baptism by fire. Laura had never experienced anything like it. The grand halls of the Met after hours, filled with New York's elite. Women in gowns that cost more than cars, men in tuxedos that were definitely bespoke. Champagne that probably cost $50 a glass. And everyone wanted to meet Alexander Thorne's mysterious new wife. How did you meet? Asked a woman in head-to-toe Valentino, her eyes sharp with curiosity. What do you do? Asked a man in his 60s, his tone suggesting he couldn't imagine she did anything at all. Your ring is stunning, gushed another woman, reaching for Laura's hand. How long have you been engaged? Laura fielded questions for 3 hours, her face aching. From smiling, her feet killing her in 4-inch heels she'd never worn before. Alexander stayed close, his hand on the small of her back, possessive and protective in equal measure. You're doing well, he murmured during a brief moment of privacy. Very convincing. I'm glad my performance meets your standards. He frowned at her tone but didn't comment. They were approached by a couple, the man tall and silver-haired, the woman petite and beautiful with an air of old money about her. Alexander, the man said warmly, extending his hand. Congratulations are in order, I hear. Thank you, Charles. Alexander shook his hand and then turned to Laura. Darling, this is Charles Harrington and his wife, Victoria. Charles sits on our board of directors. It's lovely to meet you, Laura said, extending her hand. Victoria took it, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. How wonderful that Alexander finally settled down. We were beginning to think he was married to his work. She laughed, but there was an edge to it. You must tell me your secret. How did you capture the heart of New York's most eligible bachelor? Just one click. Subscribe, leave a like, and say where you're watching from. Your support is essential for our growth. Laura felt the weight of scrutiny, the underlying challenge in Victoria's question. This woman didn't believe the story. Or maybe she just resented it. Maybe she'd had designs on Alexander herself. No secret, Laura said, keeping her voice light. We just connected. Sometimes you meet someone and you just know. How romantic, Victoria said, her tone suggesting she found it anything but. And you're a nurse, I understand? I am. That must be so fulfilling. The pause before fulfilling made it clear Victoria thought it was anything but impressive. What hospital do you work at? St. Mary's in Brooklyn. Brooklyn. Victoria's smile sharpened. How quaint. Charles cleared his throat, sensing the tension. We should let you two enjoy the evening. Laura, welcome to the family. As they walked away, Alexander's hand tightened on Laura's back. Don't let Victoria get to you. She's a shark who smells blood in the water. Did she have designs on you? Half the women here did. He said it matter-of-factly, without ego. But that doesn't matter anymore. You're my wife now. That makes you untouchable. The possessiveness in his voice made something flutter in Laura's chest, something she immediately tried to suppress. This wasn't real. He was playing a part, just like she was. But as the night wore on, as Alexander introduced her to more and more people, his hand never leaving her back or her waist or her hand, Laura found herself forgetting that it was fake, found herself leaning into his touch, found herself laughing at his dry jokes and meeting his eyes across crowded rooms. And she wasn't the only one noticing. You two seem very much in love, Richard said, when they visited him 3 days before the Tsao engagement party. He was recovering well, back to his usual sharp-eyed self. "Alexander, I've never seen you so attentive." Alexander's arm was around Laura's shoulders as they sat on the couch in Richard's study. "She brings out the best in me." "Clearly." Richard studied them both. "You know, when your grandmother and I first got married, everyone said it wouldn't last. I was too focused on business. She was too independent. But we found a way. We learned that marriage isn't about losing yourself. It's about becoming more yourself with someone who sees you completely." Laura felt Alexander's arm tighten almost imperceptibly. "Your grandmother sounds like an amazing woman," Laura said softly. "She was. Died 15 years ago, and I still miss her every day." Richard's eyes were distant. "But I had 45 years with her. 45 years of partnership, of building a life together. That's what I want for you, Alexander. That kind of love. That kind of foundation." After they left, neither Alexander nor Laura spoke until they were back in the car. "He really loved her," Laura finally said. "Yes. And you're honoring her memory by lying to him." Alexander's face was granite. "I'm giving him peace. That's all that matters." But Laura saw the tension in his jaw, the way his hands clenched into fists. He wasn't as immune to the guilt as he pretended. Back at the penthouse, they'd fallen into a strange routine. Alexander left for work at 6 a.m. and often didn't return until 10 p.m. or later. Laura spent her days reading, exploring the city, and trying not to think about the life she'd left behind. They ate dinner together when Alexander was home, usually takeout since neither of them cooked. And they'd talk about the upcoming party, about who would be there, about how they needed to behave. But there were moments, small, unexpected moments, when the performance slipped. Like when Laura couldn't figure out how to work the complicated espresso machine in the kitchen. And Alexander had appeared beside her, his body close as he guided her hands through the process. His breath had been warm on her neck, and for a moment, she'd forgotten how to breathe. Or when Alexander came home late one night to find Laura curled up on the couch, crying silently while watching old videos of her mother on her phone. He'd sat down beside her without a word and just stayed, his presence solid and unexpected and oddly comforting. "Sorry," she'd said, wiping her eyes. "I'm fine." "You're allowed to not be fine," he'd said quietly. "Grief doesn't follow a schedule." She'd looked at him then, really looked at him, and seen something in his eyes that matched her own pain. "You still miss your parents?" "Every day." He'd paused. "But especially at night, when the work is done, and it's quiet, and there's nothing to distract you from the fact that they're gone." They'd sat there together in the dark penthouse, two people who'd both lost too much. And for a moment, the contract between them felt less like a business transaction and more like a lifeline. The night before the engagement party, Alexander came home earlier than usual. Laura was in the kitchen, attempting to make dinner, actual dinner, not takeout, with ingredients she'd bought from a farmer's market in Union Square. "What are you doing?" Alexander asked, loosening his tie as he watched her chop vegetables with the intensity of someone defusing a bomb. "Making pasta, or trying to." Laura looked up at him, flour somehow on her cheek. "I know we usually order in, but I thought it might be nice to have a real meal before tomorrow." Something softened in Alexander's face. He set down his briefcase and rolled up his sleeves. "Let me help." "You cook." "My grandfather insisted I learn. He said a man who can't feed himself is dependent on others." Alexander moved to the sink to wash his hands. "What are we making?" "Carbonara, I think." The recipe made it sound simple, but I'm pretty sure I'm doing it wrong. Alexander looked at her amateur attempt and bit back a smile. "You're drowning the pasta, and you need to use the pasta water in the sauce. That's what makes it creamy." For the next hour, they cooked together. Alexander guided her through the steps with surprising patience, and Laura found herself laughing when she accidentally splattered sauce on his expensive shirt. He'd looked down at the stain, then up at her, and instead of being angry, he'd smiled. Really smiled. The first genuine smile she'd seen from him. "You're dangerous in a kitchen," he said. "You're not bad yourself, for a CEO." They ate at the kitchen island instead of the formal dining room, and the conversation flowed easier than it ever had. They talked about movies, about books, about the ridiculous price of real estate in Manhattan. Alexander told her about his childhood, about how his grandfather had taught him to ride a bike in Central Park. Laura told him about her mother's insistence on making pancakes every Sunday, no matter how tired she was. And for those few hours, it didn't feel like a performance. It felt real. "I'm nervous about tomorrow," Laura admitted as they cleaned up. "All those people, all those eyes on us." "We'll be fine. We've been convincing so far." "Have we?" Laura looked at him. "Or are we just lying well?" Alexander was quiet for a moment. "Maybe there's not much difference." "I think there is. Lying is active. Convincing means people want to believe it." She dried the last plate and set it aside. "Your grandfather wants to believe you're happy. That's why he's convinced, not because we're good liars. Does it matter? The result is the same. I think it matters a lot." Laura turned to face him fully. "Alexander, what happens after the 30 days? When we annul this marriage and you go back to being alone? Will you really be okay with that?" His face closed off immediately. "That was always the plan. Plans change. Not for me." He stepped back, putting distance between them. "Don't romanticize this, Laura. We have a contract, a business arrangement. That's all this is." "Is it?" She didn't know what made her say it. Maybe the wine they'd shared with dinner, maybe the warmth of the evening, maybe just exhaustion with the constant pretending. "Because sometimes when you look at me, I think you forget we're acting." Alexander's jaw tightened. "You're imagining things." "Am I?" "Because I'm pretty sure I'm not. The only one who's been confused about what's real and what's fake anymore." For a moment, she thought he might admit it, might say something honest, something raw and true. But then he turned away, his walls slamming back into place. "Get some rest," he said coldly. "Tomorrow is a big day. We need to be perfect." He walked away, leaving Laura alone in the kitchen, her heart pounding with a truth she wasn't ready to face. Somewhere in the last 2 weeks, she'd stopped acting. And that terrified her more than anything else. The engagement party was every bit as extravagant as Richard had promised. The venue was the Thorne family estate, but transformed. The gardens had been lit with thousands of tiny lights, creating a fairy tale atmosphere. A full orchestra played on the lawn. Waiters in white jackets circulated with champagne and canapes that probably cost more per bite than Laura used to spend on a week's worth of groceries. And everyone who was anyone in New York was there. Laura stood in the bedroom that had been set aside for her to get ready, staring at herself in the mirror. The dress Isabel had chosen was stunning. A floor-length gown in deep emerald green that hugged her curves and made her skin glow. Her hair had been styled in loose waves, her makeup was perfect, and the diamond necklace Alexander had given her that morning, "On loan from the family collection," he'd said, sparkled at her throat. She looked like she belonged in this world, but she'd never felt more out of place. "You look beautiful." Laura turned to find Alexander in the doorway. He was devastating in a black tuxedo, his dark hair perfectly styled, his blue eyes sharp and assessing as they took her in. "Thank you," she managed. "You clean up pretty well yourself." He moved into the room, holding out his hand. "Ready?" "Not even a little bit." "Good. Neither am I." His mouth quirked. "But we're going to be brilliant anyway." His hand was warm and steady as she took it. And together, they walked downstairs to face the crowd. The next 3 hours were a blur of introductions and small talk, of dancing and toasts and endless photographs. Richard gave a speech that made Laura's eyes sting, talking about how happy he was to welcome her into the family, how Alexander had never looked so content, how love was the greatest legacy anyone could leave. Every word was a knife in her gut. But she smiled through it all, laughed at jokes, accepted congratulations, stood beside Alexander, with his arm around her waist, playing the role of the blissfully happy bride-to-be. And then Victoria Harrington cornered her by the bar. "Laura, darling," Victoria said, her smile sharp as glass. "I've been meaning to have a word with you." "Of course." Laura's instincts immediately went on alert. "I've been thinking about your relationship with Alexander, and there's something that doesn't quite add up." Victoria sipped her champagne. "You see, I had dinner with Alexander just 6 weeks ago. At that dinner, he told me he had no intention of getting married. In fact, he said, and I quote, 'Marriage is for people who have time for emotional complications.'" Laura's heart hammered. People's feelings can change quickly when they meet the right person. Can they? Victoria's eyes were cold. Or is it possible that this whole thing is a bit too convenient? Alexander's grandfather has that new will, the one that requires marriage for full inheritance. And suddenly, out of nowhere, Alexander is married to a nurse he barely knows. "Careful, Victoria." Laura kept her voice steady. "You're coming dangerously close to calling me a gold digger." "Am I?" Victoria smiled. "I'm just saying what everyone here is thinking. You come out of nowhere. You marry one of the richest men in New York after knowing him for what? A few weeks. And we're all supposed to believe it's true love." Laura felt her control slipping. "You don't know anything about our relationship. I know Alexander Thorne. I've known him for 10 years. And I know he doesn't let people in. He doesn't trust easily, he doesn't love easily, and he certainly doesn't marry easily." Victoria leaned closer. "So either you're some kind of miracle worker, or this whole thing is a sham, and I'm betting on the latter." Before Laura could respond, a hand slid around her waist. "Victoria," Alexander said, his voice deadly quiet, "I'd appreciate it if you didn't harass my wife." Victoria's smile didn't waver. "I was just congratulating her on landing such an impressive husband." "Were you?" It wasn't a question. Alexander's arm tightened around Laura. "Because it sounded like you were suggesting our marriage isn't legitimate. I would never suggest such a thing. I'm sure you have a perfectly good explanation for the whirlwind romance." Victoria's eyes glittered. "After all, it's not like you need the inheritance money. You're already wealthy in your own right. So if you did marry for convenience, say, to satisfy your grandfather's will, well, that would be fraud, wouldn't it? And fraud would invalidate the inheritance entirely." The threat hung in the air between them. "Enjoy the party, Victoria," Alexander said coldly. He guided Laura away, his hand firm on her back. They didn't speak until they were alone in the garden, away from prying eyes and ears. "She knows," Laura said, her voice shaking. "Or she suspects. Alexander, if she tells your grandfather, she won't." "How can you be sure?" "Because if she tries to prove anything, she'll have to admit she's been investigating us. That she's obsessed with my personal life. It'll make her look pathetic and jealous." Alexander's jaw was tight. "But she's right about one thing. People are going to talk. People are already talking. What do? We stay the course. We don't give anyone ammunition." He looked down at her, and in the moonlight, his face was all sharp angles and shadows. "We make everyone believe this is real." "How?" Alexander didn't answer with words. Instead, he pulled her close and kissed her. It was nothing like the chaste kiss they'd shared for the cameras at their courthouse wedding. This was real, urgent. His mouth moved against hers with an intensity that made her knees weak, his hands tangling in her carefully styled hair. Laura gasped against him, and he deepened the kiss, backing her against a tree where the shadows were darkest. When he finally pulled back, they were both breathing hard. "That's how," Alexander said roughly. "We give them a show they can't doubt." But as Laura stared up at him, her lips still tingling, her heart racing, she wondered if that had been for the cameras at all. Or if maybe, just maybe, the line between performance and reality had finally, irrevocably blurred. The kiss changed everything. After that night in the garden, Alexander became different, attentive in ways that felt dangerously real. He'd come home from work and seek her out, asking about her day. He'd reach for her hand in private, not just in public. He'd look at her with an intensity that made her breath catch. And Laura, despite every warning her brain was screaming, found herself falling. "We're going to the Hamptons this weekend," Alexander announced one evening over dinner. "My grandfather has a house there. He wants us to visit." "The two of us alone?" "The three of us. He'll be there too." Alexander pushed his food around his plate. "He wants to spend time with us, get to know." "You better." The weekend in the Hamptons was both wonderful and torturous. Richard's beach house was actually a mansion, because of course it was, right on the ocean with views that took Laura's breath away. They spent the days walking on the beach, having meals on the terrace, and playing board games in the evening. It was the closest thing to normal family life that Laura had experienced since her mother died, and it made the deception so much worse. "You two should think about children," Richard said one evening as they watched the sunset. "You'd make beautiful babies together." Laura nearly choked on her wine. "We're taking things one step at a time," Alexander said smoothly, his hand finding Laura's under the table. "Don't wait too long. Life is short. You never know how much time you have." Richard looked out at the ocean. "I wish your grandmother could have met Laura. She would have loved her." That night, Laura couldn't sleep. She stood on the balcony of the guest room she was supposed to be sharing with Alexander, separate beds, per the contract, and stared at the waves crashing against the shore. "Can't sleep either?" She turned to find Alexander in the doorway, wearing only pajama bottoms, his chest bare. Laura tried not to stare at the defined muscles of his abdomen, the way the moonlight played across his skin. "Too much on my mind," she said. He joined her on the balcony, standing close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. "What are you thinking about?" "Your grandfather. How happy he is. How much he loves you." She paused. "What we're doing to him. We're giving him peace. We're giving him a lie." Laura turned to face Alexander. "And every day it gets harder to remember that. Every day it feels more real. And that scares me, Alexander, because in 2 weeks this ends. The contract expires, and we go our separate ways, and your grandfather will have to be told something, and it's going to break his heart." Alexander was silent for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was rough. "What if it didn't end?" Laura's heart stopped. "What? What if we extended the contract? 6 months instead of 30 days? A year? Long enough to—" He stopped, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know what I'm saying." "Yes, you do." Laura's voice was barely a whisper. "You're saying you don't want this to be fake anymore." "I'm saying—" Alexander looked at her, and the vulnerability in his eyes nearly broke her. "I'm saying that somewhere in the last 3 weeks I forgot we were acting. I'm saying that I look forward to coming home because you're there. I'm saying that kissing you in the garden wasn't for the cameras. It was because I wanted to. Because I've wanted to since the night I met you in the hospital." Laura couldn't breathe. "Alexander, I'm saying I'm falling in love with you, Laura. And I know that wasn't part of the contract. I know it's a complication neither of us signed up for. But it's the truth." The words hung in the air between them, heavy and impossible and terrifying. "We can't," Laura said, even as her heart screamed at her to say yes. "Alexander, this started as a business arrangement. You paid me to pretend to be your wife. How can anything real come from that? I don't care how it started." He stepped closer, his hand cupping her face. "I care where we are now. And right now, at this moment, I want you more than I've ever wanted anything. Not as a fake wife, not as a contractual obligation. As you, just you." "I'm in love with you too," Laura whispered, the truth finally breaking free. "But that doesn't change the fundamental problem. Your world and my world, they don't overlap. I'm a nurse from Brooklyn who wears scrubs to work and eats ramen for dinner. You're a billionaire CEO who owns penthouses and throws parties with orchestras. How does that work in real life?" We make it work. How? I don't know yet, but I'm willing to figure it out if you are. His thumb traced her cheekbone. Laura, I've spent my entire adult life focused on work, on success, on building something that would make my grandfather proud. I thought that was enough. But then, you walked into my life and showed me what I was missing. Connection, laughter, someone who sees me, really sees me, not just the company or the money or the Thorn name. You see me, and I see you. Doesn't that count for something? It counted for everything. Laura's answer was to pull him down into a kiss that was nothing like the performance in the garden. This was real, raw. A promise and a question and a leap of faith all wrapped into one. Alexander lifted her, and her legs wrapped around his waist as he carried her inside, his mouth never leaving hers. They fell onto the bed together, and for the first time since this arrangement began, there were no contracts, no performances, no lies. Just two people who'd found each other in the most unexpected way and were finally letting themselves feel it. When Laura woke up the next morning, wrapped in Alexander's arms, she felt something she hadn't felt in months. Hope. Maybe they could make this work. Maybe love was enough. But as the sun rose over the Hamptons, neither of them knew that their happiness had an expiration date, and it was coming sooner than they thought. The problem arrived in the form of a phone call. They'd returned from the Hamptons on Sunday evening, giddy and tangled together in a way that made Laura's heart sore. Alexander had actually called in sick to work on Monday, the first sick day he'd taken in 5 years, and they'd spent the day in bed, talking and laughing and making love like teenagers. "I want to do this right," Alexander said as they lay together, Laura's head on his chest. "No more contract, no more pretending. I want to take you on a real date, court you properly." "We're already married," Laura laughed. "Then I want to marry you again, for real this time. A ceremony where the vows mean something, where we're not lying to anyone, including ourselves." Laura kissed him. "I'd like that." But Tuesday morning, reality crashed back in. Alexander's phone rang at 6 a.m. He answered it groggily, then sat bolt upright, his face going pale. "When?" A pause. "I'm on my way." "What's wrong?" Laura asked, dread pooling in her stomach. "It's my grandfather. He had another heart episode. He's at Mount Sinai." Alexander was already out of bed, pulling on clothes. "I have to go." "I'm coming with you." They made it to the hospital in 20 minutes. Richard was in the ICU, attached to monitors and looking frighteningly small in the hospital bed. The doctor, a cardiologist Laura recognized from her rotation years ago, pulled them aside. "It was a major cardiac event. We've stabilized him, but the next 72 hours are critical." The doctor looked at Alexander with sympathy. "You should prepare yourself. At his age, with his history, recovery isn't guaranteed." Alexander's hand found Laura's, squeezing tight enough to hurt. "He's going to make it. He has to." They sat vigil for 3 days. Laura called into St. Mary's to extend her leave. Alexander's assistant brought work to the hospital, but Alexander barely looked at it. They just sat, hour after hour, watching Richard sleep, watching the monitors, praying. On the 3rd day, Richard woke up. "Alexander," he rasped, his voice weak. "Laura, we're here, grandfather." Alexander leaned close. "You're going to be okay. You're a fighter, remember?" Richard's hand found Alexander's. "I need to tell you something. About the will. That can wait." "No, it can't." Richard's eyes were serious. "I lied to you. About the inheritance requirement." Laura felt Alexander go rigid beside her. "What?" Alexander's voice was barely a whisper. "There is no marriage requirement. I never updated the will with that clause." Richard coughed weakly. "I just wanted to see if you'd do it. If you'd actually find someone. Settle. Down. Be happy. I was testing you, boy. And you passed. You found Laura. And even if this marriage was originally some kind of arrangement..." Alexander's face had gone white. "Grandfather, let me finish." Richard squeezed his hand. "I know it started as business. I'm old, Not stupid. I had you investigated, Alexander. I know about the contract. I know about the money. Laura felt the world tilt. But here's what else I know, Richard continued, his eyes moving between them. I know that real love grew from that arrangement. I've watched you two over these past weeks. The way you look at each other when you think no one's watching. The way you orbit each other like magnets. That's not acting. That's the real thing. Tears streamed down Laura's face. So here's what I want you to understand, Richard said, his voice getting weaker. The inheritance is yours regardless. It always was. But the real gift I'm giving you is each other. Don't waste it. Don't let pride or fear or the complicated way this started keep you from the love you found. Promise me. I promise, Alexander said, his voice breaking. I promise, grandfather. Good. Richard closed his eyes. Now let an old man rest. I'm tired. He died quietly 3 hours later, with Alexander and Laura on either side of his bed. The funeral was a massive affair. Hundreds of people, media coverage, a who's who of New York society. Laura stood beside Alexander through all of it, his anchor in the storm of grief. But after the funeral, after the will was read, and the lawyers departed and the house was finally empty, Alexander and Laura sat in the penthouse and faced the truth neither of them wanted to acknowledge. The contract is up tomorrow, Laura said quietly. The 30 days are over. I know. Your grandfather knew the truth, which means the whole premise was false. You didn't need a fake wife. You never did. I know. Alexander's voice was hollow. So where does that leave us? Laura turned to. Look at him. Do we stay married, get divorced, pretend the last month didn't happen? What do you want? I asked you first. Alexander was quiet for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was raw. I want you to stay, not because of a contract or an inheritance or anything else, just because I love you. Because my grandfather was right. What we found is real and I don't want to lose it. But, Laura could hear the unspoken word, but I don't know if I can trust it. Alexander looked at her, and the pain in his eyes matched her own. How do we know this isn't just Stockholm Syndrome? We were forced together, forced to play-act intimacy. How do we know what we feel is genuine and not just a byproduct of the situation? We don't, Laura said honestly. But isn't that true of any relationship? You never really know. You just have to trust. I don't trust easily. I know. And you have every right to walk away. You fulfilled your contract. You earned your money. You don't owe me anything. Laura felt tears prick her eyes. Is that what you want? For me to leave? I want... Alexander's voice broke. I want to be sure. Of you. Of us. Of this. And I'm not. And maybe I never will be. And that's not fair to you. The silence stretched between them, heavy with all the things they couldn't say. Finally, Laura stood. I'm going to pack. She saw Alexander flinch, but he didn't stop her. It took her 2 hours to pack the life she'd built in the penthouse. The designer clothes Isabel had picked out. The jewelry Alexander had given her. The little things she'd accumulated over 30 days that had felt like a lifetime. When she emerged with her suitcases, Alexander was standing by the window, staring out at the city. I'm keeping the money, Laura said. It wasn't a question. She'd earned it. Every penny. Of course. And I'm keeping the ring. She looked down at the engagement ring still on her finger. Unless you want it back. It's yours. Laura waited for him to turn around, to look at her, to ask her to stay one more time. But he just stood there, silhouette against the glass, unreachable. Goodbye, Alexander. She left without looking back. 3 months later, Laura was back at St. Mary's, working double shifts and trying to remember who she'd been before Alexander Thorne walked into her life. The debt was paid off. She'd moved to a better apartment, nothing like the penthouse but clean and safe and hers. She'd started seeing a therapist to process everything. The loss of her mother, the bizarre month of playing pretend, the real love that had grown in impossible soil. She still wore the ring. She told herself it was because it was valuable, because selling it would raise questions she didn't want to answer. But really, it was because taking it off felt like admitting it was over. And she wasn't ready to admit that yet. "Nurse Christensen, you have a visitor," Dr. Martinez said one evening as her shift was ending. "He's waiting in the consultation room." Laura's heart jumped. She'd spent 3 months hoping Alexander would come, would fight for her, would prove that what they had was worth the risk. But every day her phone stayed silent. Every night, she went home alone. "Did he give a name?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Dr. Martinez smiled. "He said you'd know who he was." Laura's hand shook as she walked to the consultation room. She pushed open the door and it wasn't Alexander. A man she'd never seen before stood by the window. He was older, maybe 60, with silver hair and kind eyes. He turned when she entered. "Nurse Christensen? Laura?" "Yes?" "My name is James Mitchell. I was Richard Thorne's attorney." He pulled out a chair. "Please sit. I have something for you." Confused, Laura sat. James opened his briefcase and pulled out an envelope. "Mr. Thorne left this for you, with instructions that it be delivered 90 days after his death." James handed her the envelope. "He was very specific about the timing." Laura took it with trembling fingers. Her name was written on the front in shaky handwriting. "I'll leave you to read it privately," James said. He paused at the door. "For what it's worth, Mr. Thorne spoke very highly of you. He said you were exactly what his grandson needed." Then he was gone, and Laura was alone with a letter from a dead man. She opened it. "My dear Laura, if you're reading this, then I'm gone, and you and Alexander are no longer together. I suspected this might happen. My grandson is brilliant in business, but an absolute coward in love. Let me tell you something about Alexander. When his parents died, he was 8 years old and convinced it was his fault. He'd asked them to come to his school play. They were driving back from it when the accident happened. He spent the last 24 years building walls so high and so thick that no one could get close enough to hurt him again. But then you came along, and somehow, in 30 days, you did what no one else could. You made him want to tear those walls down. You made him want to risk his heart. That terrified him, and so he did what he always does. He ran. He intellectualized it, turned it into a question of trust and authenticity, and all those things that sound rational but are really just fear dressed up in fancy clothes. I'm writing this letter to tell you not to give up on him. Yes, your relationship started in an unusual way, but so what? Love doesn't care about how it begins. It only cares about where it goes. Here's what I know. My grandson loves you. He's just too scared to admit it. And you love him, or you wouldn't have stayed for the funeral, wouldn't have stood by his side when you had every reason to walk away. So I'm asking you to do something difficult. I'm asking you to fight for him, to go to him and tell him that you're not going anywhere, that he doesn't get to decide your love isn't real just because it scares him, that you're in this together, for better or worse, and he needs to stop running. Will it be easy? No. Alexander is stubborn and proud and sometimes insufferably logical, but he's also kind and loyal and capable of deep, abiding love. He just needs someone brave enough to believe in him. Be that person, Laura. Be brave. Fight for the man you love. And if all else fails, remind him that his grandmother and I started as a business arrangement too. She was my secretary. I hired her because I needed someone organized. I married her because I couldn't imagine my life without her. Sometimes the best loves are the ones that sneak up on you. With all my faith in both of you, Richard Laura read the letter 3 times, tears streaming down her face. Then she stood up, grabbed her coat, and headed for the door. It was time to fight. Alexander was in his office at 11 p.m., because where else would he be? He hadn't been sleeping, hadn't been eating properly. Work was the only thing that made sense. Anymore, the only place where his decisions had clear outcomes and quantifiable results. Unlike love, which was messy and uncertain and had left him more broken than he'd ever been in his life. He heard the door to his office open and assumed it was his assistant. "Not now, Jennifer. Whatever it is can wait until—" "It's not Jennifer." Alexander's head snapped up. Laura stood in his doorway, still in her scrubs, her hair pulled back in a ponytail, her eyes fierce. "Laura." He stood, automatically. "What are you doing here?" "Your grandfather left me a letter," she said, walking into the office and closing the door behind her. "He told me to fight for you, to not let you run away from this because you're scared." "I'm not scared. You're terrified." Laura moved closer. "And I get it. I'm terrified too. This thing between us, it's complicated and messy, and it started in the worst possible way. But it's also real, Alexander. It's the realest thing I've ever felt. You don't know that. We were performing, Stop." Laura held up her hand. "Stop rationalizing. Stop intellectualizing. Just for 1 minute, stop thinking and feel. What do you feel when you look at me?" Alexander stared at her. At this woman in scrubs who'd walked into his life and turned everything upside down. At this brave, beautiful, impossible person who'd seen through all his walls and loved him anyway. "I feel like I can breathe," he said quietly. "For the first time in 24 years. Since my parents died, I feel like I can breathe. Because you see me. Not the CEO or the fortune or the thorn name. You see me. The me who's still that 8-year-old boy who thinks everything is his fault. The me who works 18-hour days so I don't have to be alone with my thoughts. The me who's terrified of losing anyone else I love. Then stop pushing me away." Laura's voice broke. "I'm not going anywhere. You don't get to decide our love isn't real just because it scares you. I'm here. I'm staying. And you need to decide if you're brave enough to do the same. What if I fail you? What if I can't be what you need? What if you can?" Laura closed the distance between them, taking his face in her hands. "Alexander, I'm not asking for perfect. I'm not asking for easy. I'm just asking for honest. Be honest with me. Be honest with yourself. Do you love me?" "Yes." The word broke out of him. "God, yes. I love you so much it terrifies me." "Good, because I love you too. And we're going to figure this out together. Not because we have to, because we want to." Alexander kissed her then, pouring 3 months of loneliness and longing and love into it. Laura kissed him back just as fiercely, and when they finally broke apart, both of them were crying. "I'm sorry," Alexander whispered. "I'm sorry I let you leave. I'm sorry I didn't fight for you." "You can fight for me now." Laura smiled through her tears. "Take me home, Alexander. Our home. And let's start over. For real. This time." "No contract?" "No contract. Just us." 6 months later, they got married again. This time, it wasn't in a courthouse with lawyers as witnesses. It was in the garden where they'd had their first real kiss, with 200 guests who loved them and believed in them. Laura wore a dress that made her look like a princess. Alexander cried during his vows. "I, Alexander Constantine Thorne, take you, Laura Marie Christensen, to be my wife," he said, his voice steady, even as tears ran down his face. "Not because of a contract or an inheritance or anything else, except that you are the love of my life. You walked into my world and showed me what I was missing. You made me brave enough to try. You made me want to be better, and I promise, for the rest of my life, to fight for us, to be honest with you, to love you with everything I have." Laura was crying too. "I, Laura Marie Christensen, take you, Alexander Constantine Thorne, to be my husband. You offered me 30 days, and I'm giving you forever. Because what we found in those 30 days was worth every moment of uncertainty, every moment of fear. You see me, you chose me, and I choose you, today and every day." When they kissed, the crowd erupted in applause. At the reception, Laura found a quiet moment to stand at the edge of the garden and look up at the stars. She thought about her mother, about Richard, about all the people who'd loved her and shaped her and brought her to this moment. Thank you, she whispered. To the sky. Talking to yourself? Alexander came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. Talking to the people who got us here. Laura leaned back against him. Do you think your grandfather would have approved? I think he's probably gloating in whatever afterlife exists. He did call it, after all. Alexander kissed her temple. He knew before we did that this was real. He was a smart man. The smartest. Alexander turned her to face him. Are you happy? Deliriously. Laura smiled up at him. Although I have to say, pretend to be my wife for 30 days has to be the strangest proposal in history. Maybe, but it worked out pretty well in the end. Alexander kissed her softly. I love you, Laura Thorne. I love you too, Alexander Thorne. They stood there together under the stars, two people who'd found each other in the most impossible way and turned a business arrangement into a love story that would last a lifetime. Because sometimes, the best things in life are the ones you never see coming. And sometimes, 30 days is all you need to find forever. 1 year later, Laura sat in the nursery of their new house. Not the penthouse, which they'd sold, but a brownstone in Brooklyn with a garden and room for a family, and rocked her 3-month-old daughter to sleep. Emma, named after Laura's mother, Evelyn, with the middle name Victoria after Alexander's grandmother, slept peacefully in her arms, tiny fists curled under her chin. Alexander appeared in the doorway, fresh from putting the finishing touches on the nursery mural he'd been working on. He was covered in paint and smiling that soft smile he reserved just for his family. She down, he whispered. Finally. Laura looked up at him. Come here. Alexander crossed the room and sat beside her, his arm around her shoulders, as they both watched their daughter sleep. Outside, Brooklyn hummed with life. Inside, they had everything that mattered. Do you ever think about how this started? Laura too asked quietly. About that first night in the hospital, the contract, how insane this whole thing was. Every day, Alexander kissed her hair. And every day, I'm grateful you were crazy enough to say yes. Best 30 days of my life. Best 30 days that led to the rest of our lives. Laura looked at him. This man who'd walked into her emergency room and changed everything. Who'd offered her a deal that seemed too good to be true and had turned out to be the best decision she'd ever made. If you could go back, she said, knowing everything that would happen, the complications, the grief, the uncertainty, would you still do it? Alexander didn't hesitate. Yes. 1,000 times yes. Because it brought me here. To you. To her. To this life that I never knew I wanted until I had it. Good answer, Laura said, smiling. It's the truth. They sat there together, their daughter sleeping between them, and watched the sun set over Brooklyn. Two people who'd started as strangers bound by a contract and ended as a family bound by love. And somewhere, Laura liked to think, Richard and Evelyn were watching, smiling, knowing that sometimes the most unexpected arrangements lead to the most beautiful destinations. Because love doesn't care how it begins, it only cares where it goes, and theirs was just beginning.